Welcome back to the deep dive. And if you are listening to this right now, I'm guessing you might be in a bit of a panic. Maybe you have a microbiology exam in like an hour, or maybe you're just standing in front of a patient's room realizing you don't actually remember how bacteria make people sick.
It happens. It really does. The details fade, but the concepts are what matter. That's why we're calling this the last-minute lecture edition.
Exactly. We are taking a stack of source material, specifically Chapter 3 of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews, Microbiology, and we're basically turning it into a painless, high-yield audio study guide. Our focus today is pathogenicity.
Which is really the core of clinical microbiology. I mean, it's one thing to just memorize a list of bugs. It's another thing entirely to understand the mechanism. Pathogenicity is the how. How does a microscopic organism actually cause damage to a human being?
And if you understand the mechanism, you understand
the treatment. Precisely. We aren't just memorizing facts. We are building a framework for diagnosis.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to break this chapter down into 4 main chunks. First, the vocabulary of infection, the words you need to speak the language. Second, the bacterial invasion playbook, step by step from entry to damage.
Then the heavy hitters.
Right, exotoxins versus endotoxins. And finally, we'll switch gears and see how viruses hijack our cells.
It sounds like a lot, but it really follows a logical narrative. It's a story of invasion.
So let's start with the setup. Segment 1, the vocabulary of infection. Now, I'm looking at figure 3.1 in the text, and it's basically a lineup of terms. But these aren't just dictionary definitions, are they?
No, not at all. They represent the whole spectrum of the host-pathogen relationship. First, you have the term pathogen. Simply put, it's any microorganism capable of causing disease. But, and this is so crucial, having the pathogen doesn't always mean you are sick.
And that brings us to the asymptomatic category.
Right, you have the infection, but 0 symptoms. The text uses asymptomatic gonorrhea as the key example here.
Which is just terrifying from a public health perspective.
It is. I mean, if you don't feel sick, you don't seek treatment, but you are still shedding bacteria and infecting others. It's a silent spread.
Then you have latent infections. I always think of this as the sleeping tiger scenario.
That's a perfect analogy. The organism is present, but it goes dormant. It's not replicating, it's not causing symptoms, but it's not gone. It's waiting.
And the classic examples here are Treponema pallidum, syphilis, and Mycobacterium tuberculosis.
Exactly. They can hang out in your system for years, decades even. Then, if the conditions change, they wake up and reactivate.
And usually they wake up when your defenses are down, which leads us to the opportunistic infection.
These are the bullies of the microbial world. These organisms are generally harmless to a healthy person. They might even be part of your normal flora.
Right.
But if your immune system is compromised, say by HIV or chemotherapy, they seize the opportunity.
And the text highlights pneumocystis pneumonia.
Yes. If you see pneumocystis, you immediately have to ask, why is this patient's immune system failing? It's a hallmark of immunodeficiency.
Now, there's one more term on this list that I love, mostly because it sounds so dramatic. Fulminant.
It comes from the Latin for lightning.
That implies speed and violence.
It does. A fulminant infection occurs suddenly and escalates with incredible intensity. The example given is necrotizing fasciitis caused by Streptococcus pyogenes.
A flesh-eating bacteria.
Correct. And it's called fulminant because of the sheer velocity of tissue destruction. You can sometimes literally watch the redness spread across the skin in real time.
Okay, so we have our vocabulary. We know what kind of infections we're dealing with. Now let's look at the how. Let's get into segment 2, bacterial pathogenesis.
The invasion playbook.
Right. So if I'm a bacterium and I want to cause trouble, I can't just show up. I have to survive. The text starts with this numbers game, ID50 and LD50.
This is a concept that shows up on exams constantly. ID50 is the infectious dose, the number of organisms you need to cause infection in 50% of a pest population.
And LD50.
Lethal dose, the number needed to kill 50%.
And the comparison between bacteria here is just wild.
It is. Look at Shigella. It causes dysentery. The ID50 is fewer than 100 organisms.
That is tiny. That's practically microscopic dust.
It means Shigella is incredibly efficient at bypassing your defenses. Now, compare that to Salmonella.
Okay.
To get a Salmonella infection, you typically need an infectious dose of around 100,000 organisms.
So Shigella is a sniper, and Salmonella is more of a brute force army.
Precisely. Salmonella relies on numbers to survive the stomach acid. Shigella just doesn't care.
Okay, so let's say we have the numbers. Step 1 is entry. We have to get in.
Respiratory tract, ingestion, urogenital tract, or breaks in the skin, those are your ports of entry. But the moment bacteria enter, the body attacks. We have enzymes in our saliva, acid in our stomach.
So the smart bacteria have shields. The text mentions capsules here.
Capsules are huge. Organisms like Streptococcus pneumonia or Neisseria meningitis, they wrap themselves in a polysaccharide capsule. It's this slimy outer layer.
And what does that actually do for them?
It makes them slippery. Your immune cells, the phagocytes, they try to grab onto the bacteria to eat them, but because of the capsule, they just slide right off. It's an anti-phagocytic shield.
Okay, so they've slipped past the guards. Step 2 is adherence. They need to stick the landing.
If they don't stick, they get washed away. Think about the bladder urine is a constant flushing mechanism. So bacteria use tools called pili or fimbri.
Like little Velcro hairs.
Exactly. Or grappling hooks. And here is a massive clinical takeaway from the text. Structure dictates function.
Let's unpack that a bit.
Take Neisseria gonorrhea. It is only pathogenic if it has pili. If you have a strain of gonorrhea that loses the genetic ability to make pili, it becomes harmless.
Wow.
It physically cannot stick to the urogenital tract to cause disease.
So that's a high-yield fact. No pili, no grip, no gonorrhea.
Correct. Now, step 3, invasiveness. They've stuck to the surface, but now they need to break into the deeper tissue.
The text calls this invasiveness, and it lists some chemical weapons, collagenase and hyaluronidase.
These are enzymes. Think of your tissue like a brick wall. The cells are the bricks, but they're held together by mortar. That's the extracellular matrix, made of collagen and hyaluronic acid.
And these enzymes, they dissolve the mortar.
Exactly. Collagenase breaks down collagen, hyaluronidase breaks down hyaluronic acid. They are effectively melting a path through the connective tissue so the bacteria can spread freely.
That is a visceral image, melting through the tissue. Okay, so step 4 seems to be about logistics. The invasion force needs supplies.
Specifically, they need iron. Iron is absolutely essential for bacterial growth, but the human body knows this. We have what's called nutritional immunity. We keep our iron locked away in proteins like transferrin and lactoferrin.
So the bacteria have to steal it.
Most bacteria produce compounds called siderophores.
Which sounds like a sci-fi villain.
It does. Siderophores are like little iron magnets. The bacteria secrete them. They go out and they strip the iron from our proteins and bring it back to the bacteria.
But the text mentions that Neisseria, again, with this bug, does something different.
Neisseria breaks the rules. It doesn't make siderophores. Instead, it has specific receptors on its surface that lock directly onto human transferrin.
So it docks with our proteins and just drinks the iron straight from the tap.
It cuts out the middleman entirely. It's incredibly efficient.
Okay, so let's recap the invasion. We entered, we used a capsule to avoid getting eaten, we used pili to stick, we used enzymes to melt a path, and we stole iron to fuel the growth. Now, we cause damage.
And this brings us to segment 3, exotoxins versus endotoxins.
Okay, if you're a student listening to this, pay attention. This is probably the most important distinction in this entire chapter.
Absolutely. You will see this on boards. You will see this in the clinic.
Let's break it down. Exotoxins first. What are they?
So exotoxins are proteins. They are secreted by the bacteria into the surrounding environment, and both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria can make them.
The text points us to figure 3.3, which shows the AB structure. This seems to be the standard design for these toxins.
It is. Think of it as a two-stage delivery system. The B component stands for binding. It's the key. It finds a specific receptor on a specific host cell and locks on.
And that opens the door for the other part.
Right. It allows the A component, the active part, to slip inside the cell. The A component is the bomb.
And what does the bomb do?
It depends on the toxin. The classic example in the text is the diphtheria toxin. Once that A component gets in, it modifies a protein called elongation factor 2, or EF2.
And for those of us who haven't taken cell bio in a while,
EF2 is essential for making proteins. If you shut it down, the cell can't synthesize anything. It stops functioning and dies. That is the mechanism of diphtheria cell death through protein synthesis inhibition.
now, because exotoxins are proteins, they have a weakness, right? Heat.
Yes, proteins are heat labile. If you cook them, they denature and stop working.
Which is useful. And we can also use that against them in vaccines.
Exactly. We can treat these toxins with formaldehyde to deactivate them. They lose their toxicity but keep their shape. We call these toxoids, the tetanus shot you get. That's a toxoid. It trains your immune system to recognize the shape of the toxin without making you sick.
Okay, so exotoxins are precise, heat-sensitive protein weapons. Now let's flip the coin. endotoxins.
Endotoxins are a completely different beast. First rule, they're only found in gram-negative bacteria.
Why only gram-negatives?
Because endotoxin is actually a structural component. It's lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. It's part of the outer membrane that gram-positives just don't have.
So the bacteria aren't secreting this as a weapon. It's literally part of their body.
Exactly. The toxic part of the molecule is called lipid A, and it's not released while the bacteria is alive and happy. It's released when the bacteria die and break apart.
And what happens when lipid A hits our bloodstream?
Unlike the precise strike of an exotoxin, lipid A triggers a massive, chaotic alarm system. It activates macrophages, it causes the release of cytokines like IL-1 and TNF.
And the symptoms?
Fever, hypotension, which is dangerously low blood pressure, and disseminated intravascular coagulation, which is clotting all over the body.
That sounds like septic shock.
It is septic shock.
Yeah.
And here is the paradox, and this is the aha moment for clinical students. Imagine you have a patient with a massive gram-negative infection. You give them a huge dose of antibiotics.
Okay. So the antibiotics kill the bacteria?
Right. But as those millions of bacteria die and burst open, they release all their lipid A at once.
So the patient actually gets worse?
Initially, yes, their fever spikes, their pressure crashes. You have to anticipate that. You aren't doing it wrong. It's just the mechanism of the endotoxin release.
That is fascinating. And also, unlike the exotoxins, you can't just cook this away, can you?
No, endotoxins are heat stable. You can boil them, and they are still toxic.
So exotoxins are proteins, specific targets, heat sensitive. Endotoxins are LPS, systemic shock, heat stable. Got it.
Perfect summary.
Let's move to segment 4, the detective work. We know the mechanisms, but how do we prove which bug causes which disease?
This brings us to the history books. Robert Koch. He established the rules, or postulates, for causation.
Figure 3.4 diagrams this loop. Could you walk us through it?
It's 4 steps. Step 1. The organism must be found in every sick animal, but not in healthy ones. That's association.
Okay.
Step 2. You must be able to isolate that organism and grow it in a pure culture in the lab. Isolation.
Right.
Step 3. You take that cultured bug, put it into a healthy animal, and it must cause the same disease. Causation.
And last step.
Step 4. You must be able to re-isolate the organism from that experimentally infected animal. Confirmation.
It's a rigorous legal argument for biology, but biology is messy.
Biology loves exceptions. Koch's postulates are the gold standard, but they have major limitations. The biggest one is step 2, grow it in a pure culture.
Because some things just refuse to grow in a petri dish.
Exactly. Treponema pallidum, syphilis, and Mycobacterium leprosy cannot be grown in vitro. You can't culture them on agar, so technically you can't fulfill the postulates.
And this applies to viruses too, right?
Yeah, even more so. Viruses are obligate intracellular parasites. They need living cells to replicate. You can never grow a pure culture of a virus on a plate like you can with E. coli.
That is the perfect segue to segment 5, viral pathogenesis. Because if bacteria are invaders, viruses feel more like hackers.
That's a great way to put it. Bacteria are living cells. They have their own metabolism. Viruses are just genetic code wrapped in a protein box. They have to hack our system to do anything.
Figure 3.5 outlines 4 ways a cell reacts when it gets hacked by a virus. Let's go through the list.
The first is the most straightforward, cell death. The virus hijacks the cellular machinery to make more virus. It stops the cell from making its own proteins. Poliovirus does this.
And the cell just.
The cell eventually shuts down, dies, and bursts, releasing the new viruses.
Simple and brutal. What's reaction number 2?
Transformation. This is insidious. The virus integrates its genetic material into the host cell's DNA. Instead of killing the cell, it mutates it. It removes the growth limit.
So the cell starts dividing uncontrollably.
Yes. It becomes malignant. It becomes cancer. This is how some viruses are oncogenic or cancer-causing.
Then there's cell fusion.
This is a big visual clue. Some viruses, like herpes viruses, cause the membranes of infected cells to fuse with their neighbors,
Creating a kind of monster cell.
essentially. You get these giant multinucleated cells. If you look under a microscope and see a giant cell with 10 nuclei, you think herpes virus.
And the 4th reaction.
Cytopathic effect, or CPE. This is really a catch-all term for any visible change in the cell's appearance, rounding up, inclusion bodies, disintegration. It's what the pathologist looks for to say, yes, there is a virus here.
So we have the cellular takeover. Now segment 6 is about the commute, spread and transmission.
The routes of entry are similar to bacteria inhalation, ingestion, but once inside, viruses often utilize the bloodstream. We call this viremia.
The blood acts like a superhighway.
Exactly. It might start in the lungs, like measles, but it travels via the blood to the skin to cause the rash or to the brain.
Now, there is a specific type of transmission depicted in Figure 3.7 that is crucial for anyone interested in pediatrics or OBGYN, vertical transmission.
Mother to infant. This is a major area of clinical focus. The text breaks it down into 3 stages.
Stage 1 is in utero.
Transplacental spread. The virus crosses the placenta from mom to fetus. Rubella and CMV, cytomegalovirus, are the big concerns here. They can cause congenital defects.
Stage 2 is during delivery.
As the baby passes through the birth canal, the baby is exposed to maternal blood and fluids. This is a primary risk for herpes simplex and HIV.
And stage 3 is after birth.
Via breast milk. Again, HIV and CMV can be transmitted this way. Knowing when the transmission happens helps us know how to prevent it.
So we have the invasion, the toxins, the viral hacking, and the transmission. How does the story end? How do we terminate the infection?
It's a race between the pathogen replicating and the immune system catching up. We have 2 main arms of defense described here. First, the cell-mediated response.
The assassins.
Yes. Natural killer cells, or NK cells, and cytotoxic T lymphocytes. Their job is to find the factories, the infected cells, and destroy them before they can release more virus.
And the second arm.
The humoral response. This is the antibody squad.
Missile defense.
Exactly. Antibodies float in the blood and fluids. They can neutralize the virus, basically coating it so it can't grab onto a new cell. Or they can tag infected cells so that the complement system can come in and pop them.
It really is total warfare at a microscopic level.
It is. And understanding the specific weapons like the exotoxin AB structure or the bacterial capsule and the specific defenses is what gives you the upper hand in medicine.
So let's wrap this up with a quick last-minute lecture recap. If our listener is walking into the test center right now or just wants to impress on rounds, what are the top takeaways?
Hey, let's hit the high yield points. 1, the numbers. Low ID 50 means high virulence, like Shigella.
Okay.
2, adherence. Pili are crucial. No pili on Neisseria gonorrhea means no disease. Structure equals function. 3, toxins. This is the big one. Exotoxins are proteins with an AB structure. A is the active bomb, B is the key. Endotoxins are lipid A, found only in gram-negatives, and they cause septic shock when the bacteria die.
Crucial.
4, Koch's postulates. They prove causation, but they fail for viruses and unculturable bugs like syphilis. And 5, viral outcomes. Viruses can kill cells, transform them into cancer, or fuse them into giant cells.
Perfect. And here's my final thought for the listener. We talked a lot about that AB toxin structure. If you have 30 seconds, go pull up Figure 3.3 in Lippincott.
I agree. Don't just memorize the letters A and B. Visualize the mechanism. See the B component locking onto the cell surface and the A component slipping inside.
If you can visualize the mechanism, you don't have to memorize the text. It becomes intuitive.
That's the secret to microbiology.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into pathogenicity. Good luck with your studies, good luck with your exams, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Stay curious.